The closer look generally presents a lot of interesting and insightful analysis, and has offered up a lot of really solid takes in the past. However, I fundamentally disagree with a lot of the points raised in Henry's recent video entitled Star Wars: How to Kill a Franchise, and I wanted to take this opportunity to offer an opposing viewpoint. I realise that a lot of the discourse surrounding the Star Wars sequels online leads towards a dislike, which is completely fine. Not for a second am I suggesting that you can't dislike these films. They're after all pretty flawed in a lot of areas. I'm writing this as someone who really rather enjoyed the sequels, so I realise I'm in the minority in that respect, but I want to make it clear straight away that if you didn't like the sequels, I'm not trying to change your mind or suggest that you're wrong in any way. As I say, they're not without their flaws, but this video is focused with responding to Henry's video, as I felt a lot of his talking points to be problematic or misrepresentative of the films he's critiquing. The video begins with a summary of his main points.
Two things that I think we can all agree on are this. Overall interest in the Star Wars franchise is at an all-time low, and the recent Star Wars trilogy, even if there were moments of merit, was woefully worse than it could have been.
Of the former, I don't think we can all agree. The last year saw the release of The Mandalorian, the final season of The Clone Wars, Jedi Fallen Order, and a whole host of books and comics, most of which have proven to be massively popular amongst not only fans but general audiences. The Rise of Skywalker, regardless of your thoughts on the film, grossed over $1 billion worldwide, which by no stretch of the imagination could be considered a flop. I'm not sure how you can make the claim that interest is at an all-time low, when not only have all these properties been successful in some way, but there are still a slew of new shows on Disney Plus planned, as well as more feature films over the coming decade. Certainly, you could compare the box office numbers for The Force Awakens and The Rise of Skywalker and see that there's undoubtedly been a drop in cinema attendance for the franchise. However, that same argument could be applied to both the original and prequel trilogy, and the franchise as we know has endured long after those films. Perhaps if you only look within certain circles in the online fandom, you could ascertain that interest is at an all-time low, but for general audiences and a significant portion of the fanbase, there is definitely an appetite for more Star Wars content. You only need to look at the reception to The Mandalorian and The Clone Wars to realise that the fanbase hasn't moved on. Of the latter point, he is completely right. The sequels were worse than they could have or perhaps should have been, but they were also a lot better than they could have been too. If you genuinely think The Last Jedi is the worst film ever made in the history of cinema, then that is your opinion and you're entitled to it, but I do think you should watch some more films. The video is divided into three main parts, which Henry suggests are the three main reasons why the Star Wars franchise has become stagnant. Let's start with the first. The whole trilogy is a bad sequel. The main argument presented is that film sequels can either be too safe, incorporating too many familiar elements and effectively retelling the original story, or too risky, and become entirely disassociated with the original story because it deviated too far, and that therefore filmmakers producing sequels should aim for a middle ground in which their stories feature enough returning elements but are developed in interesting ways. Of this I couldn't agree more, but unlike Henry, I believe the Star Wars sequels fulfill that requirement. That said, I do think The Force Awakens perhaps played things a little too safe. Yet, if you cast your mind back to 2015, the film was praised for exactly that. In the last 5 years, there's been a real shift in opinion on the prequel films, particularly among some online communities, but in 2015, the general consensus was that they were poorly crafted and had tarnished the Star Wars brand. Therefore, The Force Awakens was seen by many as a good palate cleanser for the future of the franchise, even if it didn't push the boat out in terms of introducing new ideas or concepts into the series. I'm not suggesting that just because it was praised on release that it shouldn't be criticised now, especially now that we know how the trilogy ended, but just presenting an observation. I still think it's an incredibly fun, well-made blockbuster and has incredible rewatch value to me personally. However, Henry claims that the subsequent film, The Last Jedi, went in a totally opposite direction and was too risky. And arguably it was and still is an incredibly divisive movie because of some of the decisions Rian Johnson made. But I think that Henry has fundamentally misunderstood what Johnson was aiming to achieve with The Last Jedi.
He believed that the best way to tell these sequel stories was to burn everything down, forget everything that came before and start from scratch. And when it comes to purely making a good film, Johnson's approach is genuinely viable. But when it comes to making a good sequel, without a shadow of a doubt, it's a terrible philosophy, like quite possibly the single worst philosophy it is possible to have.
I've seen this argument crop up before and it's patently untrue. It's not what The Last Jedi was about at all. In the context of the film, it's the stance that the villain, Kylo Ren, has.
It's time to let old things die. Snoke, Skywalker, the Sith, the Jedi, the Rebels, let it all die.
To think that this was the message of the film is like watching Infinity War and thinking that wiping out half of all life is a good solution to depleted resources. I don't understand how anyone can interpret the film this way, not least of all because of its ending.
The rebellion is reborn today. The war is just beginning. And I will not be the last Jedi.
Even though the film did pose some interesting questions about the dichotomy of the Empire versus the Rebels, it ends with the status quo being reasserted. The Resistance survivors escape to found the rebellion again. Rey is on the path to begin a new Jedi Order, and Kylo Ren has assumed the mantle of Supreme Leader and is poised to establish the dominance of the First Order like the Empire before it. If anything, the film affirms the idea put forward in The Force Awakens that the past will repeat itself. In no way does it burn everything down. The main evidence Henry uses to support his claim is how Luke Skywalker was portrayed in the film, and I should emphasise that he is more than welcome to dislike how Rian Johnson chose to portray Luke. What I take issue with is this statement.
I really don't like using this word in opinion piece video essays. I really don't, but I think this time it's warranted. What I think is an objectively bad call from Rian Johnson was how he handled Luke.
Well, you're absolutely right to not like using that word, because your use of the word objectively is objectively wrong. There are only a handful of things you can claim are objective about a film. For instance, you could say that The Last Jedi was released in 2017, it was written and directed by Rian Johnson, and it was the 8th film in the Skywalker saga. However, anything even remotely analytical about films, or any form of text for that matter, is entirely subjective. So when you say that your opinion that Rian Johnson mishandled Luke was objectively a bad call, you're saying that your opinion is the correct one, the only valid one, and that if anyone disagrees with you, they're wrong. And this is why I decided to make this video, because I'm fine with the fact that we disagree about the Star Wars sequels. In fact, I welcome the discussion, but for you to claim that your opinion is fact is insultingly condescending, especially from someone who is clearly intelligent enough to articulate their grievances with the series without resorting to claiming objectivity. I understand that most of your viewers agree with you, but by saying that this line of thinking is the only correct way to interpret the film, you are perpetuating the vitriol and the air of superiority that surrounds so much of the fanbase. It's fine to dislike things, just as it's fine to like things. You don't need to claim that one way of thinking is better than the other to make your point. So unlike Henry, I'm not going to completely invalidate his opinion. He's absolutely welcome to dislike the direction the series went in, particularly with regards to how Luke was depicted, and in certain areas I do agree with him. But I would like to offer up a counter to some of his points, and suggest why I think Luke's arc in The Last Jedi worked well. But before I do, and I can't labour this point enough, neither of us are right. If you agree with Henry's analysis, that's fine. If you disagree like I do, that's also fine. Neither stance is objective. That's literally what an opinion is.
Rian Johnson has said many times in many interviews that he's a big fan of Star Wars. But I call bullshit. Rian Johnson is a talented director, like there's no doubt about it, but if he actually were a real fan of Star Wars, he would have understood Luke's character better than he did.
One of the main points made in this section of his video is that Luke's character was entirely mishandled, but he never explains why. I'm sure this is probably something that he's gone into great detail with in some of his other videos, but in the confines of this video, we're left with a point but no evidence to back it up. so I'm going to briefly explain why I think he was perfectly characterised in the film. We first see Luke in exile, having cut himself off from the Force. He wants nothing to do with the war, and he's content to wallow in his failure. Yet over the course of the film, he comes to learn from his failure, and understands that simply letting the past die is not an option. The scene with Yoda is beautiful and perfectly encapsulates this sentiment. And so he decides to return to help the Resistance in the most peaceful Jedi-like way possible. He causes a distraction which allows his friends to escape without causing any violence whatsoever. I would make a case that this act is possibly the most in keeping with the Jedi ethos we've ever seen in the entire series. Because the Jedi in the prequels were deeply flawed, and as Luke explains, this is what led to their downfall.
The legacy of the Jedi is failure, hypocrisy, hubris.
That's not true.
At the height of their powers, they allowed Darth Sidious to rise, create the Empire, and wipe them out. It was a Jedi Master who was responsible for the training and creation of Darth Vader.
The one extract Henry chooses to play over his narration to support this claim that Luke was mischaracterised is the flashback from Kylo Ren's perspective. I'm sorry, but I have to question whether you actually understood the film at this point. The film shows us 3 discrete interpretations of the flashback, with the final one being the closest to what actually happened. Of course, if you show the scene from the villain's perspective, you'll get a warped perspective of the main character.
He would bring destruction and pain and death and the end of everything I love because of what he will become. And for the briefest moment of pure instinct, I thought I could stop it. It passed like a fleeting shadow, and I was left with shame and with consequence.
Well, this changes the scene entirely, and it's totally understandable that Luke, a human character, would have a moment of human weakness.
I will not turn, and you'll be forced to kill me.
If that is your destiny.
Search your feelings, Father. You can't do this. I feel the conflict within you. Let go of your hate.
It is too late for me, son.
Yes, Luke saw the good in Darth Vader in Return of the Jedi, but a few scenes later, in a moment of weakness, he also pummeled him half to death in anger. Everyone seems to conveniently forget this scene. I personally think it's therefore entirely within character for Luke to have a similar moment of weakness again. He was never shown to be the perfect Jedi in the same way that someone like Obi-Wan was. But if you disagree, that's your interpretation. I won't try to invalidate it. I just want to offer an opposing viewpoint.
Luke simply should have been a main character in the sequels. It would have been a really safe choice to make, yet also a really good one to make. Like, sure, this would have pleased the fans, but far more importantly, it would have made the films better in terms of being good sequels because they're continuing on the story.
Again, I would have to disagree. If we were to use your favourite word and look at the sequel trilogy objectively, they're perfectly fine as sequels. They're set after the events of Return of the Jedi, they feature returning characters and returning iconography from the originals. And if you think that Luke being a main character would have pleased the fans, then you're terribly naive. Look at how some of the fans, including yourself, responded to his characterization as a side character, and imagine how exacerbated that would be if he was a main character and they got him wrong in your eyes.
These new characters are nowhere near as beloved as the original ones are.
Well, this is a bit of a sweeping statement. I mean, sure, amongst some circles of fans, the new characters like Rey, Finn and Poe aren't especially well regarded, but for general audiences, and critically the new generation of younger fans, these characters have proven to be exceptionally resonant. Again, just because you personally do not like something, does not mean that it is universally disliked. And all of the points presented in this section of the video are symptomatic of this trap of opinion presented as fact. He is suggesting that because he personally did not like the direction the sequels were taken in, that they failed as sequels. Well, that's just not true, by any metric. The sequels introduced a whole new generation of fans to Star Wars and proved to be massively financially and critically successful. And as discussed, with the volume of Star Wars related projects in the works, it seems like the franchise is here to stay. He himself admits that regular cinemagoers loved the sequel films.
One of the really interesting trends I've seen with not just every sequel film, but especially The Last Jedi, is that the people who don't care about Star Wars and just watch the films are the very people who've enjoyed the sequel trilogy more than the core fanbase has.
Well, so how then can you make the claim that they failed as sequels? The second section, and by far the longest, is concerned with the world building of the sequels, and in the main I agree with a lot of the points offered because the world building in the sequels was weak. How widespread the First Order or the Resistance factions were is never really explained, and the distinction between the New Republic and the Resistance is incredibly hazy without looking into the expanded universe. However, there are still a couple of issues I have with this section which I'd like to raise.
And when we see that the Rebels have a secret base on that salt plain, it's not even remotely interesting because we've already seen Hoth, and Hoth, by the way, is a far more interesting place than wherever it is that salt planet was.
Sorry, what? Did I hear that right? Hoth is a far more interesting place than Crate. Well, how did you arrive at that conclusion? What are you talking about? Sorry, this is an incredibly minor nitpick, but the two locations serve identical functions. They are desolate planets where the rebels established a base, where they then defend against a ground assault from the enemy. They both have some sort of primitive indigenous life, but the bases were established there precisely because there were no civilizations and the Empire wouldn't think to look for them there. The only difference, in terms of a narrative function, is that Crate is stumbled upon by the Resistance during their escape. I just don't understand why you think Hoth is a far more interesting place, seeing as there's nothing from a story perspective and very little from a visual perspective to distinguish it. In fact, I would actually argue that Crate is a more visually interesting place because of the red rock under the surface, which demonstrates the degradation of the landscape over the course of the battle.
Say what you want about the prequels, but all three films had some really good world building. If you ask me, if we're talking about nothing more than just the world building, I'd say that the prequels were better than the original films, because the settings and the cultures we see are explored in far more detail.
I could do a whole video dissecting this argument, but it's pretty tangential from the main topic, so I'll keep it brief. You're mistaking interesting settings from a visual perspective for good world building. The world building in the prequels to me is not that good. We know that there's a central government, the Republic, and the Senate made up of representatives from every system in the Republic. However, we don't know what laws they can affect on a galactic scale, or the extent to which bureaucracy is localised to the systems. We do not know why there is a separatist movement beyond knowing that it was manufactured by Palpatine. What grievances did senators actually have with the Republic to join such a movement? Why were the Jedi, a religion, so involved with the dealings of the Republic, and why do they get involved with the war despite being self-proclaimed peacekeepers? What does the Trade Federation actually trade with, and why does their blockade of Naboo cause their people to die, despite us seeing no evidence of any actual suffering on screen? To say that the world building in the prequels is messy would be an understatement. Now, I'm not saying this excuses the subpar world building in the sequels, but I do wish people would stop using it as an argument. Seeing a planet of giant flowers or a double-sided lightsaber for the first time are not examples of good world building, just interesting visual imagery. The third and final section in this video is again one that I largely agree with. Henry claims that the sequel trilogy had a confused vision, with J.J. Abrams and Rian Johnson each trying to pull the series in two different directions. Now, it's difficult not to disagree with this. I think that there are significant tonal shifts between the three films, and my main criticisms of The Rise of Skywalker stem from some of the backpedaling against the previous film. I'd recommend watching his video for this section alone because he does raise some very interesting points, but once again I'd like to bring up one which I think he's fundamentally misunderstood.
In The Last Jedi, Luke is this dark, cynical prick, but in The Rise of Skywalker, he's suddenly the very Luke we know from the originals. When Rey comes up to his Force Ghost, he's smiling and supportive and is nothing like he was in The Last Jedi. And the reason why he's suddenly back to how he was in the originals isn't because his character learned a lesson, it's because Abrams didn't like the fact he was a cynic, so he again tugged the rope back to his side of the line and did a U-turn with Luke's personality.
And again, I would defer to my previous explanation. You say his shift in character isn't because his character learned a lesson, but you offer no evidence to support that. It absolutely is because his character learned a lesson. It's literally how The Last Jedi ends, with Luke having overcome his cynicism and finding faith in the Jedi once again. It's what we call a character arc. In taking over an hour to critique the Star Wars sequels, Henry ultimately failed to answer the question he originally posed. The video's title was, after all, How to Kill a Franchise. but no evidence or explanations are given as to how the franchise has supposedly been killed. The video focuses exclusively on the 3 sequel films and how he personally disliked them, and no commentary is offered on the idea that some people actually like the sequels, which is reflected not only in the critical response to each film, but also the financial result. He's also conveniently neglected to mention the other Star Wars properties, like The Mandalorian and The Clone Wars, some of which came out after The Rise of Skywalker, which have proven to not only be massively popular critically and financially, but were a hit amongst the very fans who wrote off Star Wars after they disliked the sequels. So I ask, how on earth can you claim that Star Wars is a dead franchise? Just because you didn't like the way the films went, doesn't mean that you can claim that your opinion is an objective truth, and it certainly doesn't give you the right to say that the franchise is dead, despite evidence clearly to the contrary. To reiterate, it's completely fine to dislike the Star Wars sequels, just as it's fine to dislike literally anything. But if you're going to invalidate the opinion of anyone who disagrees with you, then I'm sorry, but I struggle to take any of your arguments seriously. I can't imagine Henry from The Closer Look will actually see this, but I found some of his points to be entirely misrepresentative of the sequels, and ultimately his arguments felt incredibly empty and certainly didn't reflect the conclusion he was trying to reach, so I felt compelled to write up this response. Seeing as how the Star Wars sequels are still a hot topic months after they finish, I may talk about my thoughts on the films more in depth in the near future, so let me know if that's something you might be interested to hear. Otherwise, if you've enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a like and subscribing, and until next time, thanks.